reality is, yes, have there been more terrorist attacks and things like that? Yes, okay? But the reality is, there hasn't been any more world wars, okay? So global war, what we're hoping is that the UN has accomplished its mission, or is accomplishing its mission, and kind of putting out a lot of those larger fires before they happen, and we have, war on a global scale. We do hear a lot more about conflicts, about terrorism, things like that, but the reality is we have a lot more news media covering a lot more things in the world, and so we tend to just hear more of those things all the time in the news. Okay, so let's jump in and talk about the next slide. Oh. So we've talked to you about the United Nations, and essentially it's this place where all countries can come together and they can work out their issues. There's 5 members on the Security Council, okay? And the membership, on the next slide, it'll show you that the membership has done nothing but grow since its inception. And it starts out with something like 50, but then it goes to, over 100. Okay. This last point here, we're going to expand on a little bit more. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it says a forum for the United States and the Soviet Union to negotiate during the Cold War. So the reality is this: look, before World War II, there's about 8 superpowers in the world. They're all trying to control, the resources and get the wealth. After World War II, we have what we call a bipolar balance of power, and you have the Soviet Union and you have the United States. And having that much power consolidated in 2 states, it caused a lot of tension for a long, long time. All right, like I said before, this graph is just showing us how UN membership has continued to grow and grow and grow. And we said earlier that it probably will continue to grow even more.
Okay, all right. So I was 1 year old when this happened. Okay, so I don't remember it, but read a lot about it. So can we see the map?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. So what was going on was you've got the Soviet Union. They're trying to get control with their economic system, with their political system, and promote that. And we're trying to get control with our political system, our economic system, and we're battling it out. Now, what the Russians are freaking out about is we put I think we call them Titan missiles. I mean, these things were primitive. I mean, you filled them up with like gasoline, okay? And they were nuclear, and this was in the event that the Russians invaded Europe, we could just nuke them, okay? And it was all secret stuff, and Americans didn't even know about it. So that's what they're upset about. So in retaliation, what they're gonna do is Cuba has gone communist under Fidel Castro, which we talked about before. They're gonna put missiles here, just 90 miles from the United States. They could reach as far as Washington, D.C. That's all we knew about. We knew this was going on. So they have this standoff where the Russians are trying to put them in and we're trying to keep them out. We end up putting a naval blockade, and meanwhile we're going through back channels. We're going through the Swedes. Their spies are talking with our spies and their spies, and then it graduates up to diplomats, and we're trying to work this all out. Whereas the Russian generals want to go to war and end it right now, take out the Americans, and the American generals want to go to war and take out the Russians, because that's the way they're trained. We get the military and we train them to win, and then that's why we want civilian politicians, presidents, because they can listen to the generals and go, okay, that's a good idea, but let's listen to some other people. That's the job of the president. So that's what was going on there in this whole Cold War scenario, and we came this close to nuclear war. And people a little older than me, they remember this very vividly. Like you guys will remember COVID-19. My older cousins, this was their vivid memory in school. This is when we started doing a lot of the nuclear bomb drills. Okay, all right, so after World War II, we formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and what you could see, it was the Western European countries, Iceland, Greenland, Canada, the United States, see the Northern Atlantic. And what it was is, if the Russians invaded any of these countries, then they were invading us, all right? It was like this gang type mentality, all right? And what the Russians did was they countered 6 years later, this was 1949 and 1955, they countered with the Warsaw Pact saying, if you pick on Americans or Western Europeans, if you pick on any of the Eastern Europeans, then you're picking on us and it means nuclear war, all right? So that's the world that people my age and older grew up in, all right? The Russians were always the bad guys in cartoons, in movies. The only thing we were afraid of was scary dogs and Russians when we were little, okay? We grew up with that. So what's coming out of this is something positive. The Europeans are going, okay, we have this military alliance against the Russians. That's good. But we've always been fighting over territory. We've always been fighting over resources. We've always been fighting over markets. So they start with just something real simple. 5 or 6 countries start trading steel and coal, or iron ore and coal. And then it grows into eventually, on the test, it may say 28 countries in the European Union, free trade, no tariffs. You can travel back and forth across each other's borders with just your, passport. I don't even know if you need a passport to go across. Do you? Mr.
No.
Hillstrom's been there. Okay, no. When I go, I've only been to Spain.
You just need your one passport for all of Europe.
Okay, one passport for all of Europe. All right. And then recently, what the question might be is, is there only 27 countries? We've talked about Brexit, and when we do the map review, we'll make sure that we do that, what we think is possible questions. All right, but we've talked about it before, and we will talk about it again. All right. ComCon, no, everything I've read, they're going to talk about NATO and European Union on the test. Okay. All right, so you see these growth of supranational organizations to promote peace. And the Europeans have not gone to war since. There was that little blow up in the Balkans in the 1990s. But since then, people that have always been fighting have gotten along because they're trading. Okay? All righty. Is this still me?
Yep.
Okay. Some more organizations. Obviously airspace, they're doing it. Now, what happened is we also started doing this in the Western hemisphere. You see the Organization of American States. If anybody picks on a Latin American country or Canada, they're picking on us, all right? And then you start seeing some cooperation. Remember we said that in the 1960s, Africa is becoming decolonized. And so they start actually working together to try to come up with some mutual agreements. They're way behind, but it's going better. And then finally, a Commonwealth, that's where you take all of the former British colonies, and they're like in this club. They do economic cooperation, trade cooperation, and they also have like sporting events. They have like the Commonwealth Games, and it's about 55 countries, isn't it? Yeah, where they get together, and if you're playing together, then you tend to get along better. Sure, there's that competitive stuff, but the fans are mingling and then drinking in pubs afterwards. They're much more cooperative and nicer to each other. Okay. Still me?
You.
Still me. All right. So here you can see this was the Warsaw Pact, and this was NATO. All right. And you included Canada and the United States.
I'll tell you about NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So we talked about, last time I was up, we talked about the world splitting into 2 superpowers. So NATO forms originally as sort of like insurance. So they feel like if Russia keeps expanding, that they're going to have military backing from other countries. So the idea is like, if Poland or if Germany here is part of NATO and Russian forces invade Germany again, right? Because they control part of Germany, they control East Germany. If that happens again, NATO forces are going to come alive and they're going to come and attack. Okay. Now the answer to that, the Russian answer to that, was the Warsaw Pact. Okay. And the Warsaw Pact was the same kind of thing. It's like, well, if Western forces are too aggressive and they start to, infiltrate us with their democracy and their, capitalism, then we, or even with their soldiers and their weapons, then we have each other's back. Okay. So that's kind of NATO. That's Warsaw Pact and NATO. Okay. So it says NATO post-Cold War. So after the Cold War ends in the 1990s, there's really no need for Warsaw Pact anymore. Okay. Sorry, Soviet Union, but you lost. Okay. So the Soviet Union crumbles. the Warsaw Pact that was all, meant to be like, oh yes, Soviet solidarity, everyone was going to back each other. All of a sudden now those countries are afraid that that Russia might try to gain them back, might try to get them back. And so what do? They start joining NATO, okay? And so you can see up here, the original members in 1949 are the darkest colors. And then the lighter ones are the ones that join, either before 91 or after 91, okay, when the Cold War ends. So a couple real quick things, I'm gonna move on. One is that the number of NATO soldiers decreases. That makes sense, okay? There's not as much threat of military conflict gonna happen here. And so NATO's like, let's pull some soldiers out. But at the same time, the number of countries increases, okay? And trends like that are things that you're gonna wanna think through if you get a stimulus like this, okay? So take a few minutes, look at the map, dissect it a little bit, think about what you know, okay? You can use your scratch paper, you can write about it. Okay, European Union. So the EU starts in 1958, and it's 6 countries originally. And the idea behind this is to change things politically and economically. So on the political front, one of the things that led to World War II was this idea of nation states and this idea of our country versus your country. And one ethnicity is better than another ethnicity, okay? And so one of the ideas is putting all of these various countries, which are very different ethnically, linguistically, historically, putting them into a common group where they can kind of work out issues, work through political issues. But the big one, for me at least, was economic as well. Okay, so I traveled, like Mr. Wright said, I traveled to Europe in the 90s. We did something called a Eurail Pass, where we went around, I think it was like 10 or 12 countries over the course of about 2 months. And when I was there in the mid-90s, you had to show your pass. You had to show your, what am I trying to think of the name of it? You had to think of your passport, your passport, okay? So every time you switch countries, you'd have to stop and show them your passport. So sometimes we would take a train overnight, and they'd, boom, 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 they'd wake you up in the middle of the night, check your passport, are you good to go? Okay, all right. And so that was one thing. And then the other thing was you'd have to change money. So money changing, if you changed your dollars for German, Deutschmarks, you didn't get very much back. It was almost an even trade, and sometimes the Deutschmark was stronger, okay? So maybe your dollar didn't buy very much. If you go down here to Italy, okay, and you exchanged it for the lira, now we're talking. You could pay for your hotel, you could buy a nice meal, okay? It bought you a lot more. Italy was a lot like what Mexico is to people in the United States now, okay? Your dollar is very strong. So what the idea was is they would create a common currency called the euro. And the euro would ideally have these countries that are economically stronger help out these down here, like Italy and Greece and places like that are not as strong economically. It kind of works. Like the first few years, Italy starts to pull up, even Ireland, places like that are a little bit weaker economically. They start to gain some ground, but then they have to institute a lot of policies that are not real popular or people are not used to, raising taxes, doing things like that, and their economies have started to dwindle again, okay? And that's where you see, we talked about Brexit. I don't know if that's gonna be on the test. Maybe it's too soon, I don't know, but it could be. But one of the reasons why the United Kingdom wants to leave is because the British pound is very strong, and they don't want to be paying for Italy or Spain, and their governments can default on loans, stuff like that. Okay. Jump one more thing real quick is the idea of border crossings. Okay. So one thing that the EU does is they open up borders. Okay. So if I went back now and I rode that Eurail, they wouldn't be waking me up in the middle of the night to see if I was okay to pass from one country to another. And there's good things and bad things about that. Okay. One of the good things is if you live in, I don't know, Germany, and there's really not that many jobs in the southern part of Germany, but there's a great economy in Austria, you can go and work there. right? And you don't need to go through all the red tape to try to become an Austrian citizen before you can work there.